Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
So dozens of arrests of Muslim immigrants have been made in a number of European countries over the last few days, a day after a shooting incident in Belgium involving two men believed to have returned from Syria. 15 people were arrested in Belgium and France in the past 24 hours based on an alleged plot to attack Belgian police. In Germany, 2 people were arrested after police raided a mosque and a dozen homes linked to fears that jihadi fighters were planning an attack. And in France this morning, a hostage situation at a post office ended with no casualties. It is not clear as yet what the intent of that incident was. Last night, French authorities arrested 12 people they suspect are directly linked to the Charlie Hebdo attacks, days after 54 people unconnected to the attacks were arrested for hate speech crimes. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is visiting Paris today, expressing American solidarity with French people. Among the statements he made was, quote, "No nation knows better than France that liberty has a price." Cristina, what do you make of the lens through which European and U.S. leaders are viewing this situation, as though it's a black and white issue of simply freedom versus hate?
Sure. I think it's easy to have this binary of freedom versus hate. It's harder to have a conversation about foreign policy and foreign policy decisions and the blowback that happens. And also, this conversation is also, it's easier to have this because it's used as a way to justify the curtailing of civil liberties. So for instance, there are politicians now in Europe doing the same thing as in the US in terms of trying to put forth proposals and policies that would use internet censorship and that sort of thing. And so this conversation about freedom versus hate, or that binary, allows governments to say, hey, well, let's get the public on board with curtailing civil liberties.
And then in a war that the U.S. is leading, sources from the Department of Defense announced last night that 400 American troops would be heading to the Middle East to train Syrian rebels in the fight against the Islamic State. Allies like France are also expected to contribute troops. The training sessions will apparently take place in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar. The U.S. already has 2,100 troops in northern Iraq, and that number could go up to 3,000. Washington has struggled to identify a coherent group of Syrian rebels to focus on, adding to concerns by critics that sending troops will worsen a situation fraught with conflicting loyalties. Well, Cristina, do you see the story and the first one we talked about regarding jihad in Europe as connected? And hasn't the U.S. learned that training rebel forces can be a very dangerous thing and can result in horrible blowback?
Yes, of course. There's a complete connection between foreign policy decisions and blowback. And so, and we're seeing that happen right now throughout Western Europe. But also, you know, it's interesting because the U.S. seems to never learn from its historical practices and the blowback that has happened since even before its decisions post 9/11. And so, in many ways, it might be blinded by its need to want to maintain this empire, especially the military influence that it has around the world.
And finally, here in the United States, Republicans are struggling to find a coherent policy on immigration, despite having already launched major verbal and legislative attacks on President Obama's executive actions. At a resort in Pennsylvania yesterday, a number of GOP lawmakers from the House and Senate met to hammer out a position, signaling a major split within the party. Conservative hardliners want to stick to the original plan of undoing the modest deferred action for childhood arrivals and deferred action for parental accountability programs, which Obama launched and which could enable millions of undocumented immigrants to stave off deportation. Others prefer a more lenient approach. As of now, it appears as though GOP senators will try to pass a bill like one that the House already passed, which strips funding for the programs. If some Senate Democrats don't join Republicans, the bill will likely be vetoed by the president, once more leaving the GOP without a clear plan. Well, Cristina, what do you think will happen?
Well, if the Senate does pass the bill, then I definitely think that the president will veto it. But here's what I'm also hoping will happen after this goes through, is that we continue the conversation about immigration, but we also start having a conversation that also points out the problems with the bill that President Obama has put forth in the first place. And so, for instance, there are certain policies or certain proposals more so that would increase technological surveillance on the border, that would increase Border Patrol agents. And so while I welcome the conversation that we're having about giving undocumented people in this country a way to actually stay in this country and not have to worry about deportation. At the same time, there are other elements to this proposal that need to be highlighted and also need to be debated. And so I'm hoping what will happen after this is that we can extend that conversation to these other issues, again, in the name of national security.
Cristina, always a pleasure to have you on. We'll talk to you again next Friday.
Thank you, Sonali.
Cristina Mislan is our daily Newsflash guest expert. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.